Hi, I'm Tom Engelhardt of TomDispatch.com. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. As I was preparing for tonight, I couldn't help thinking that when I grew up, I wouldn't mind being Glenn Greenwald. Lawyer, journalist, investigator, watchdog when it comes to governmental infringements of our rights, author of numerous best-selling books, he's a man for all oppositional seasons. And imagine if I, or you, were Greenwald, we would have been featured in an Oliver Stone film, and a damn good one at that. Glenn Greenwald began his professional life as a constitutional lawyer and practiced in both state and federal courts nationwide for more than a decade. And as he's written, it was in those years that he became aware of the iniquities that pervade the American justice system, particularly the way the rich enjoy the superior legal representation and therefore much better prospects for success in court than the poor. Those are quotes from his 2011 book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, which I read back then, but reread much of recently, and which remains, sadly, a remarkably relevant exploration of how, from the Watergate era on, the rich, the powerful, and the politically dominant gained the right, unlike other Americans, never to be held truly accountable for anything. It's a theme, inequality and unaccountability, what they can do to us but will never do to themselves, that has dominated his work, and even more sadly, it's likely to prove a particularly germane topic for the 1% of the 1% of the 1% era of Donald Trump. Over the years, I've come to know Greenwald well. I don't mean personally, of course. I met him for the first time this evening. I'm talking about in print, or rather, on my computer screen. I'm not even sure when I started addictively reading his columns at Salon, but I would then move on with him to The Guardian, and more recently to The Intercept, the website I visit daily that he founded with Jeremy Scahill and Laura Poitras, two other remarkable investigative figures, one of whom I've interviewed on this stage, and the other for my website, Tom Dispatch. In those years, I might call him a kind of unconstitutional litigator. After all, there aren't all that many people who have so consistently taken on what an ever more expansive national security state and White House have done to make mincemeat of the protections the Constitution once offered to Americans. His stalwart and striking work on the subject, as I'm sure you know, ended up bringing him to the very center of a riveting story of our time, one that began, as he wrote in his dramatic book, No Place to Hide, when he received an email from an unknown correspondent who signed himself Cincinnatus. It began, "The security of people's communications is very important to me." That was, of course, part of his first communication from Edward Snowden. Via that email, he found himself launched into a new world of encryption and on a daunting investigative journey that left him traveling the planet as the head of the Guardian reporting team that would win a Pulitzer Prize for breaking Snowden's story and for analyzing the National Security Agency documents released to that newspaper, the Washington Post and the New York Times. They would reveal, of course, just how deeply the NSA had by then burrowed into all our private worlds, our communications, and our lives. It was the story that also became Stone's movie Snowden, and it's a story that is in no way over, not least because God knows what the Trumpian era will mean when it comes to the oppressive and intrusive powers of the state, and also because President Obama didn't offer Snowden a pardon before leaving office, despite his whistleblowing service to Americans who had no idea what was being done in their name, including breaking into the communications of at least 35 leaders around the world, close allies among them, or what was being done to our own privacy. I won't start on his other awards here. I suspect this full house in Santa Fe knows Glenn Greenwald and his work well indeed. Let me just say that unfortunately, if he was ever planning to take a rest, he can forget it now. He's likely to find himself, busy indeed, in an era when you can already predict more Edward Snowdens emerging from the bowels of the national security state, ready to tell us about new nightmares underway therein. Such men and women, along with the journalists they may deal with, will undoubtedly be prosecuted even more fiercely by a Trump administration than by the one that preceded it. And that really says something, given the Obama administration's record when it came to going after whistleblowers and journalists. I note as well that his talk tonight promises not only to focus on threats to our rights and liberties in this perilous moment, but on new political opportunities as well, which seems like a welcome direction for all of us to be thinking in. We've entered a period of obvious upheaval in which the alt-right has gotten most of the attention, but so many, many more Americans harbor quite a different set of feelings, as was obvious last winter when I found myself with my wife, my daughter, and grandson among 400,000 protesters in New York City, so many, in fact, that it was almost impossible for long periods to move, no less march, and we represented but a small part of the millions of people, of women in particular, who made up what then could have been the largest global protest ever. To mangle Bob Dylan just a little, let's hope that something's happening here, Mr. Jones, even if we don't yet know what it is. And with that, let me stop and turn this podium over to Glenn Greenwald, a lawyer and journalist who has helped to redefine our sense of the world we live in. Glenn?
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Good evening to everybody. Thanks so much for that warm welcome and for coming out tonight. And thanks as well to Tom for those very generous remarks. And thanks especially to the Lannan Foundation for inviting me here to speak. This is the second time that I've been here. The first time was something like 2010, 2011 when they invited me to come here, and it was toward the beginning of my career as a journalist and as a writer, and I didn't know very much about the whole circuit of speaking. And so when they invited me, I actually asked a few friends who had come here. I think I talked to Jeremy Scahill and Naomi Klein and a couple of other people, and said, oh, I got this invitation from these people in New Mexico, and they said, oh my God, that's the gold standard of speaking. And in fact, everybody was so enthusiastic that I almost found it uncomfortable. It was almost kind of like a cult. I was like, wow, what did they do to people down there that make everybody so excited? And then I came down here and I was actually instantly converted. I'm one of the leading cult members now. It really is an extraordinary and very unique place to speak. The people who organize it at Lannan are incredibly warm. The professionalism of how it's organized, the beauty of this city that makes it so fulfilling to visit, and most of all, that really is quite unique is the level of support and engagement on the part of the community for this speaking series. It's something I don't need to tell you, you already know, but this is really something quite special, and I'm truly honored to have been asked to come be a part of it again. So thank you to everybody. So I do a lot of speaking events now, and I have done them for several years, and I spoke a lot during the Bush era and during the Obama era, and I've actually done a lot of speaking events this year, but they've mostly been about things like privacy and surveillance and Islamophobia and civil liberties. I actually haven't spoken, I haven't really given a speech about the Trump presidency or the Trump administration or the Trump era until this week. This is really the first time I'm actually speaking about it. I was scheduled to give some talks on it earlier this year, but had to cancel them due to some minor health problems. And so this is the first time I'm actually talking about this topic. And so I was thinking last week, I spent a long time last week thinking about how it was that I wanted to approach this and what I wanted to say and kind of the way in which I wanted to think about it. And one of the things that I realized in going through that process was that unlike the speeches that I would give about the Bush administration or the Obama administration, where there was this kind of consistent, coherent set of issues and debates that I would go and talk about that endured over the years, the war on terror abuses, torture, Guantanamo, drones, putting people in prison without due process. There are a lot of things you can say about the Trump administration and what it is, but one thing that it is completely without is any kind of stability or coherence. It's completely impossible to think about what you want to say if you want to talk about specific particular debates because it changes so quickly, not just from week to week, but from day to day and even from hour to hour. I mean, when I was thinking last week about what I wanted to say, how could I have possibly anticipated that Trump, out of the blue, would just over the weekend decide that he wanted to spend 3 days attacking NBA and NFL players? I mean, I just could never have anticipated that. And this happens all the time. I'm certain that if I tried to talk about specific political controversies during the course of the speech, Trump would tweet something, probably attacking somebody's grandmother or like ridiculing hurricane victims, and that would become the only thing people were thinking about, and what I wanted to talk about would seem obsolete. It's just very scattershot. In fact, I was thinking during the whole controversy about the football players and the basketball players, I remember thinking to myself, remember when we were like on the brink of nuclear war with North Korea, like 4 days ago? It all goes so fast. There's no way to like grasp onto anything. And so I kind of gave up on that aspiration, on that plan to kind of talk about the Trump presidency through the prism of specific political controversy, because they're just so shifting, and I don't think there'd be any profit to that. And another thing I decided that I wasn't going to do was to just sit up here for 45 minutes and just denounce Donald Trump and condemn the Trump administration and tell you all the reasons why it's so dangerous and so menacing. In part because I just believe that any person who is capable of leaving their home and finding this venue already knows that very, very well. You know, I really don't think that you need me to take up all your time talking about that. And if you do, for some reason, want that, you can always just go home and turn on MSNBC, and you'll hear that at any moment of the day. So I didn't think that was a very fruitful way to talk about it. I know I could do it. I would get a lot of cheap applause. We would all nod our head in agreement. But I felt like it would kind of be like some junk food. I would serve it up. We would all gobble it down. It would taste good for the moment. And then afterward, it wouldn't provide much nutrition. So I wanted to kind of think about how to talk about the Trump era and the implications of it and its meaning in a way that I feel like is a more kind of thought-provoking and challenging way. And so what I decided that I really need to do before I delve into some specific issues is talk about the discourse that has emerged in the wake of the victory by Donald Trump, and the way in which, kind of by consensus, we've started to think about and understand and analyze and interpret what this new political era in the United States means. And in order to understand that, I think it's important at the outset to observe what a true shock to the political system Trump's election was, in ways that I don't think we sufficiently contemplate and acknowledge. And what was so shocking about his election wasn't merely that, at least in terms of his rhetoric and behavior and personal attributes and comportment, he deviated so much from what we've all been trained to expect a politician at that level who exercises that degree of power is going to exhibit. It isn't just that, it's also the way in which it happened. Because if you remember in September and October of 2016, there was a virtual certainty among the elite opinion-making class in the United States that he was going to lose. There was almost no chance assigned to the possibility that he could win. You could look in the New York Times, and they had their very sophisticated graphs where the blue bar represented Hillary Clinton's chances of winning and the red bar represented Donald Trump's, and the blue bar went all the way over almost to the end. It was a 96 or 97 or at times 98% probability that she would win, and Trump was 2 or 3%, and that happened, that endured right up until the day of the election. And so when he won, it was such a shock to the system, not just because of who he was, but because it undermined so much confidence in so many institutions on which we rely to understand the world, or at least the political component of our world. It made it seem as though political punditry and journalistic expertise and polls and data analysts all really have nothing to offer, that their pronouncements are actually unreliable. And when something like that happens, when we actually reach the conclusion that the things on which we rely to understand the world and to make it predictable and decipherable are actually unreliable, it produces a kind of dislodgement, a kind of disorientation, really a collective mania, because it is a really frightening event when that happens. It would be as though if we woke up tomorrow And we had the expectation that gravity would continue to function, and yet suddenly gravity stopped working, and objects, instead of being wedded to the ground, were floating. We would have a lot of fear about why that happened and what came next. And to me, that is a metaphor for how the Donald Trump presidency has affected Americans, all of us collectively. It's like some kind of huge tree that represents our certainty and understanding about how the world functioned was just instantly uprooted by the root and was just flying around in air and is looking for something to grasp onto, just to have some base, some solidifying force to feel stable and rooted again. And I think that sensation has not only endured, but in so many ways intensified as the realization has set in that he is going to be president for at least the foreseeable future, and that there isn't going to be some dramatic event within the next few days or few weeks or probably even few months that will end what a lot of people are regarding as this nightmare. And so the disorientation has only intensified. And I think what that has done is in a lot of ways produced a discourse about the Trump presidency that is not just misleading and obfuscating, but actually in a lot of ways very unhealthy and really quite dangerous as well, for reasons that I want to talk about. Because I think that it's very important that we not just be reactive to the Trump presidency, but that we actually think rationally and constructively about what it means and what the implications are. Because so often, so much of the opposition is reactive. He posts some kind of tweet, everybody follows it along and expresses an outrage until his next tweet comes up or his next outrageous statement, and then people chase that. It's almost like a rat who has been pumped full of cocaine and PCP and who's just running around madly. And then instead of observing that, we're all rats kind of chasing behind him, trying to catch him and kill him. And so we all end up just as frenetic and unhinged as he is. And so I really want to avoid that because I don't think that produces a very powerful or a very effective form of response. It's very reactive, and it tends to be just as manic and just as incoherent as he is. So what I want to do instead is talk about what I think are the ways that we've all kind of decided by consensus to conceive of this presidency, and then examine whether or not that is a particularly convincing way to understand this course of events. And what I think has been the most predominant aspect of how we've decided we're going to talk about the Trump presidency and how we're going to try and understand him is that there are a lot of just human temptations that are very natural whenever something terrible and scary happens, particularly when something terrible and scary happens that wasn't expected. There are coping mechanisms that as human beings we have when confronted with those kind of events. One, I think, very potent temptation that human beings have is a desire to believe that those kind of events that are scary, that are alarming, that seem very threatening and menacing, that events like that are actually just aberrational, that they're anomalies, that they're not the natural byproduct of the world as we know it or as we think it should be, that something just went wrong in the system and produced this kind of one-time event that isn't a reflection of our reality. It's actually a reflection of the opposite of our reality. It's something that's foreign to what it is that we all believe in and what it is that we think we're a part of. And I think you can see that sentiment predominate in how Donald Trump is talked about most frequently. This is what I hear all the time when I listen to people talk about Donald Trump. This is what I think you can hear on every TV station, in every newspaper, with our neighbors, with our Facebook feed. People say things like, this is not who we are as a country. This is not America. Every time Trump says or does something that is xenophobic, or bigoted, or militaristic, or threatening, people always say, this is not what America is about. And I always react to that by saying, it's not? That's not what America is about? Because you can certainly make the argument that the aspirations that we have, the values that we try and strive toward about what we are not those things. But you certainly can't make the argument that any of those attributes, any of those values, any of those ideas are foreign to the American experience, that they simply arose for the first time when Donald Trump was elected. And you see examples all the time of Trump being spoken of as some kind of pioneer of abuse that the American landscape has never previously tolerated and would never have previously accepted, that in fact is extremely common to our history, both distant and recent. So my favorite example in this genre that I find incredibly misleading was, as I'm sure most of you remember, several months ago in the summer, Trump invited the Egyptian dictator, General Sisi, to the White House. And he put him in the Oval Office, and he welcomed him in a press conference, and they shook hands in front of the cameras. And people in both political parties and across the political spectrum in the media were outraged by this. This was an incredible scandal. And there were so many media accounts, including, I have to confess, one that was published at The Intercept where I write, but so many others, that said something along the lines of, I cannot believe that Donald Trump has abandoned decades of American precedent practiced by presidents in both political parties by standing next to and embracing a human rights abuser. No American president would ever have possibly thought about doing such a thing previously. And everybody was saying this with a straight face like it was the most obvious thing in the world, that American presidents just keep dictators at a distance and fight against them and don't align with them or praise them or welcome them to the White House. And what was so amazing about that was that Hillary Clinton in 2009, when the Arab Spring began and when the uprisings were in their incipient stages, was asked about what the U.S. posture was towards the Mubarak government, which Egyptians were very courageously congregating in Tahrir Square and other places in Cairo in order to demonstrate against and demand the ouster of. And what she said when asked about that, and I quote, is, I regard President and Mrs. Mubarak as very good friends of my family, and I look forward to seeing them each time that they come to the United States or that I go to Egypt. President Obama in 2013 and 2014, when he paid a state visit to India, literally cut it short and flew to Saudi Arabia when King Fahd died in order to pay homage to the Saudi tyrants and the Saudi regime. The idea that it is some kind of an aberration or some kind of a departure from American political life for a US president to embrace a dictator is the exact opposite of reality. The entire American strategy in post-World War II foreign policy has been to prop up and support and embrace and align with dictators who serve American interests. And so it isn't just that when we talk about Trump in this misleading way, that embracing dictators like General Sisi is some kind of unique Trumpian invention that he pioneered and that it is a degradation of American values. It isn't just that it's misleading. It's that it actually really obscures critical problems in our politics that we lose sight of if we pretend that they are singularly created by Donald Trump. When I was preparing to come here and speak and make this very point, I was just looking through the Washington Post website. It was like 72 hours ago. And I'd already decided I wanted to make this point, and up on my screen popped the most amazing example illustrating this point. This actually might supplant the Sisi example as my favorite one. This is literally just 3 days ago from the Washington Post, and this is the headline of the Post article, which is a very faithful summary of the article's contents. The headline was, "New Trump rules could ensure that guns end up in the hands of dictators." Wouldn't that be shocking as an American to learn that your government did something to let guns end up in the hands of dictators? This would be a scandal. How could any American stand for this? And this is what you see over and over again. And I truly do understand the temptation to think that way. It is very comforting to believe that when we see Donald Trump doing heinous things, that it is not the America that we know, the political system of which we're a part, the political culture with which we identify, that it is not an extension or continuation of those things, but some kind of radical departure from them. But I don't think it matters how comforting it is. I think the question is it true and is it healthy to believe? And I would submit that buying into this mythology, embracing this narrative, that so much of what Trump does has never been done before, is a violation of American norms as opposed to a reflection of it, is a very unhealthy mythology to believe. Now, I don't want to overstate this case too much, because there are genuinely unique and new aspects of the Trump presidency that are actually dangerous. And a lot of it is rhetorical, and a lot of it is policy related, including stuff to which we pay the least amount of attention. Things like the extraordinarily severe rollback of regulations and servitude toward American business, things that get almost no attention in the daily scandals of online new media. But I do think it is worth endeavoring to understand the extent to which this is actually new, and the extent to which it is an extension or continuation of what we've allowed to take root and become the actual American way of political life. Now, a related point I want to make about this is that there is an equally strong temptation whenever a country experiences particular problems or difficulties to believe that the origin of the problem is not domestic, but instead is foreign. This is a universal dynamic. If you look at how oppressive regimes around the world try and distract their citizens from the evils those regimes do and the problems they create, they're constantly pointing to some foreign villain as the actual author of those problems. And there are a lot of reasons why, as Americans, we should want to see an investigation of questions surrounding the role that the Russians played in the American election and the possibility that various members of the Trump campaign collaborated or colluded with the Russians in terms of influencing the election. But the extent to which that issue has taken center stage, where across the political aisle, American elites are preoccupied with rejuvenating a Cold War in the name of believing that all of our problems are traceable to the Kremlin, that Putin is not some fumbling dictator, but some kind of an omnipotent mastermind, I think stems very much from this human desire to believe that when things go wrong for us, it can't be our fault, but the blame has to lie somewhere outside of our borders with some foreign villain. If you look at American discourse over the last 230 years, you can pretty much find every American problem being pinned on some convenient foreign cause. And I think we need to safeguard against believing that Donald Trump is somehow un-American, that it could only be the byproduct of Kremlin maneuvering and chicanery. I think there's lots of reasons to believe that in so many ways, Donald Trump might actually be the most American president elected in several decades. I want to make one last point on this whole question of the discourse surrounding Trump and how to understand it. And I think this is probably the most difficult one to think about, but probably the most important as well. And that is the question of, and the temptation that human beings have to exonerate ourselves and to declare that we're not at fault when bad things happen. And this, I think, is probably the strongest influence in how these narratives have been shaped. And for me, this story begins back in June of 2016, which was the first time, if you look at the media way of discussing the Trump presidency, the first time the US media really began to discuss the possibility that Donald Trump might actually win the election. And the catalyst for that recognition was the enactment or the passage of the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. And the reason the passage of Brexit convinced some people that Trump might actually win wasn't just because the consensus of the media in the UK was that Brexit was bad and that it wouldn't pass, although that was true. And people said, well, if Brexit can pass, contrary to the expectations of the media class, maybe Trump can win also. There was some of that, some uprooting of those certainties about what we can rely on. But there was a much more profound and substantive reason why the enactment of Brexit foretold or portended the possibility that Trump might win. There's a reason why Brexit passed, even though British commentators and British experts and British elites were telling the voting population that there was no valid reason to leave the EU, that in fact leaving the EU would wreak havoc on the British economy, on British culture, on all of the British national life. And that wisdom was simply rejected. And the reason it was rejected is because there was a huge part of the United Kingdom living outside of London who didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, whose economic life has been decimated over the last 30 years by very deliberate policies that the British government has pursued in terms of free trade and globalism and sacrificing national sovereignty in the sake of institutions that suck jobs out of the UK and left them without much of an economic future. And that left them so angry and so full of grievance that even though they believed, a lot of them did, that Brexit would harm their interests rather than help them, they were so at a loss for what their future would entail under the prevailing order that they were willing to burn it all down. In fact, eager to burn it all down as an expression of their contempt for the ruling class that had created a life for them that they found so grim, not just for themselves, but for their children and their grandchildren. And I think if you look at the United States, there's not much doubt that there are very obvious parallels that one finds, and it's true throughout Western Europe as well. Over the last 30 to 40 years, it is simply undeniably the case that massive income inequality and massive wealth inequality has taken hold and strangled the middle class in the United States, so that huge numbers of people, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, who once had an expectation of all kinds of things about what their life would entail, their ability to make their kids' lives better than them, which is the consummate American dream, has completely eroded. If you go through towns in the Midwest, including the states that Hillary Clinton lost when everyone thought she would win, you can see it palpably. I spent a lot of time this summer in Wisconsin, which is one of the states that Donald Trump won unexpectedly, in Milwaukee and outside of Milwaukee, and you can see the boarded up factories and the homelessness and the joblessness and the drug addiction in rehab facilities skyrocketing because of people's hopelessness. It's not difficult to see. And the reason that has happened is not because of bad luck or fate or things out of our control. It is the very deliberate decisions that the American ruling class has made about the policies it wanted to pursue, and people know that. That free trade and globalism were ways of enriching the already rich in the United States at the expense of everybody else. And the people who realize that and the people who know it were just as angry as the Brexit voters and turned to a candidate that they knew was embarrassingly narcissistic and had all kinds of personality disorders and all kinds of risks if he were to win. They knew that as well. You can go talk to them and hear them tell you that. And yet the anger and grievance that they have been nursing, in a lot of ways for valid reasons, caused them to go and vote the way that they did. And there are a lot of elites in the United States who bear responsibility for those policies that have spawned this massive inequality and human suffering in tens of millions of people in what was once the middle class in the United States. And if you're those elites, the last thing that you want is some kind of reckoning with that, some kind of national discussion about what went wrong, about what poor decisions were made and who made them. Instead, you are very much incentivized to encourage people to think about something much less systemic, that there's only one singular evil that we need to think about and stop, that we just need to monomaniacally focus on Donald Trump and getting rid of him and weakening him, and then we can return to being the shiny city on the hill that we all know America is, with its noble institutions and its promise for a better tomorrow. That is the narrative that is being deliberately cultivated as a way of distracting from these much more systemic problems. And the reason I find that so unhealthy and the reason that I find that so dangerous is because there is now this belief that America's pathologies rest only in one individual, the removal of whom will solve America's problems again. And we talk a lot about this debate between, was it economic anxiety of the type that I just described, or was it racism and xenophobia that actually led people to vote for Brexit or for Donald Trump? And to me, that's a false choice. If you look at history, when people are suffering economically, that's particularly when they're most vulnerable to having their uglier sentiments exploited by demagogues. They go hand in hand. And so I would encourage you to think a lot more about Donald Trump and his presidency, not as the primary cause or the author of America's pathologies, but instead as a byproduct or a symptom of those pathologies. And I think that while it's true that if you remove Trump, things would get better, would feel better at least in some ways, just like if you remove a symptom of a disease, your body feels better. Removing Trump from the body politic would improve the body politic in some ways. It wouldn't in any way address the underlying fundamental pathologies that have brought us Donald Trump in the first place and that could bring us worse Donald Trumps in the future. And I'm particularly concerned that this narrative that encourages us to think that the problem lies with the election of this one person as opposed to the problems having brought us the election of this one person is a way that will just further delay our reckoning with these very systemic diseases that the United States political culture has been cultivating for a long time, and I think that's very deliberate. So that's really the prism through which I think that Trump needs to be understood, and I understand completely that that's not necessarily the most satisfying way to think about it, that it's almost more cathartic. If I were to just stand up and say, don't we all hate Donald Trump, and let's talk about all the terrible things that he's done. But I do think that that framework is ultimately a lot more constructive in terms of really uprooting these problems in a way that will endure. So I want to talk about a couple of issues now that I've kind of laid that framework about what I think the Trump presidency is actually threatening and what it is actually posing, to try and put them in their proper context and best understand them so as to best fight against them. And I want to begin with the issue on which I've spent probably the most amount of my time as a journalist over the past 12 years and before that as a lawyer, which is the question of civil liberties and the threats posed to just basic civic freedoms in the United States, often in the name of terrorism, but in the name of national security and increasingly domestic security as well. And there's this really remarkable irony that I'm experiencing as somebody who has been writing about civil liberties and working with civil libertarians for many years through the Bush and the Obama presidencies. What caused me to start writing about politics in the first place, in 2002, 2003, I was a lawyer basically minding my own business, not really paying much attention to politics. And what actually got me to the point where I thought that it was an imperative for me to do so was the change in what I perceived to be the political climate in the United States after the 9/11 attack. And in particular, the case that actually affected me the most was something that has been kind of lost to history, which is the arrest of an American citizen who was a convert to Islam, a Muslim named Jose Padilla, in 2002 at the Chicago O'Hare International Airport when he got off a plane. And he was arrested, and when he was arrested, John Ashcroft held a press conference in Moscow, of all places, in which he said that this person, Jose Padilla, had been arrested because he was the dirty bomber. He had intended to detonate a radiological bomb inside the United States. And what the Bush administration proceeded to do after arresting him was they did not charge him with any crime and give him a lawyer and then present evidence of his guilt. Instead, they declared him to be an enemy combatant. And they put him in prison for 3.5 years under torturous conditions, incommunicado, no access to lawyers, no ability to speak with anyone in the outside world, based on the theory that the president had the power to unilaterally declare somebody an enemy combatant, even a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, and imprison them without due process. And the reason that was so amazing to me was because I had always expected that that was the red line that American presidents couldn't cross. Even though, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, to his eternal shame, did that during World War II with Japanese Americans. They had an active war that, in their minds, justified that. It was decades later, people viewed Japanese American internment as an unqualified evil. And so to watch an American citizen be in prison with no due process for years and no lawyers and almost no response, a very muted response, convinced me that something had gone very wrong, that we had started to build a model of the American presidency and the American government that to me was unrecognizable when compared to what I had been taught to think about in terms of the Constitution and civics and how American politics function. That it had become a really alarmingly powerful government that was being erected and created with the consent of most of the population in the name of terrorism. And then in the Obama years, that model continued. And we saw things like the Obama administration claiming the right not just to imprison American citizens with no due process, but to actually target them for assassination by drones. A theory that they not only embraced as theory, but put into practice when they killed the US-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen in 2011 with no trial, no evidence presented to a court. And what that meant to me was that we were building a system of government where there were no longer really any checks on the most consequential duties. And I remember very well in the Bush years when I first started writing about politics and writing about these issues, I had this naivete to me because I was sort of new to the whole process. And I remember being actually surprised that Republicans weren't more upset about all of these powers that the Bush administration was claiming, because I used to hear them always say, and I, in my naivete, thought they meant it, that they believed in this very limited form of government and individual rights and keeping Washington at bay. And yet here they were endorsing the most extraordinarily invasive powers with no checks. And I used to say to them, look, I know that you're comfortable now with these powers being exercised because you trust the person who's currently in the White House, George Bush, in order to do them magnanimously and with good intentions. But try and imagine one day somebody that you trust less, like the boogeyman that I could think of for them at the moment was Hillary Clinton. And would you really trust her to be able to exercise these powers? And then in the Obama years, when I watched the same Democrats who had professed to be so concerned about these issues when it was George Bush doing it, turn silent or even supportive when Barack Obama used to do it, I used to say to them the same thing. I used to say, look, I know you're comfortable with President Obama targeting American citizens with no due process and killing them because he's such a kind and benevolent man that he would only exercise these powers for the greatest good. But imagine one day that somebody that you trust less, like, I don't know, Michelle Bachmann or Newt Gingrich, I tried to think of like the worst examples for Democrats, occupied the Oval Office. Would you actually be convinced that they should have those kind of powers? Because if not, by cheering them now and allowing them to take root, it will be too late once they have them. Well, I don't actually think that I ever convinced a single person, Republican or Democrat, by that argument. I just realized that tactic was not going to work because partisan opportunism is a much greater force in American political life than rational discourse. That was a lesson I learned the hard way. But what is really interesting is that now, lo and behold, we actually have, in one sense, the best, and in another sense, the worst, vindication for that argument I had been making for 10 years. We actually have somebody currently occupying the Oval Office who pretty much, like, just as a human being, is somebody who has this very rare trait. He's actually somebody who lacks even a single redeeming quality as a human being, which I find so amazing. I remember when I was growing up, my mother used to always tell me, she would always try and like warn me against judging people, and she would always tell me, like, look, human beings are really complicated. Even Hitler loved dogs. Like, everybody has some good in them if you just search for it hard enough. And yet Trump is actually like the example that just proves her wisdom. He's actually somebody who is literally bereft of any positive human traits. I mean, usually when people compile that level of wealth, they at least make some charitable donations just to like placate their own conscience or for appearance sake. And David Fahrenthold won the Pulitzer Prize at the Washington Post because he proved that all of Trump's claims about his charitable donations were just fictitious. He never actually gave a single cent to any charity. Instead, he was putting gold plates in the bathroom of Trump Tower. And so you have somebody now occupying the Oval Office who is the kind of person that was beyond what I was envisioning when I was saying, imagine Hillary Clinton or Michelle Bachmann or Newt Gingrich. And yet we have this model of the presidency that we've allowed to take hold under both political parties that really does offer very few limits on what presidents can do. The reason the Trump presidency is as threatening as it is not because he suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but because the model of executive power and government power that we've vested in the person who occupies that White House is unlimited. And just to kind of illustrate the continuity that I'm describing, there was an incredibly poignant example of what it is that I'm talking about that happened early on in the Trump presidency, when, as probably a lot of you remember, the very first military action that Donald Trump authorized and ordered was a commando raid on a base or a camp in Yemen that he believed contained al-Qaeda fighters. And he sent in the storied SEAL Team 6 in order to go take out these terrorists. And they got there, and the operation was a complete debacle. It was a complete disaster. They got there, and it was basically filled with old women and children, and they ended up massacring 30 civilians. And the face of that massacre became this incredibly beautiful 8-year-old Yemeni girl whose grandparents made sure that her pictures ended up in the press. She was this 8-year-old girl, and the picture that I remembered that was everywhere in the media was her with a red bow in her hair and a red dress. And her name was Nawar al-Awlaki. She was 8 years old. And everybody was horrified by this, saying indiscriminately killing civilians is not who we are. This is not what America stands for. And what was so striking to me about that was that in 2011, just 6 years earlier, President Obama, after he killed Anwar al-Awlaki, the US-born cleric, in a drone strike in southern Yemen, 2 weeks after that, killed Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who was also an American citizen born in Colorado, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who, as it turns out, was the teenage brother of the 8-year-old girl, Nawar al-Awlaki, that Trump killed in that commando raid. And so I think you can see the mythology of trying to isolate Trump as this radical departure from American political life in this very poignant example, where not only did he invoke the almost limitless powers that both political parties have vested in the presidency, but he used them in such a way to target the very same family and to kill a grandchild of the very same grandfather who had lost his other grandson just 6 years earlier, not under Donald Trump, but under the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize winner named Barack Obama. And so I think that continuity was really powerfully illustrated in that way. So the last point I want to talk about is some questions surrounding surveillance and privacy and the like. And in part, I want to talk about that because people get really angry if I ever speak and don't talk about surveillance and privacy. It's like, I don't know, going to like see a concert by a rock group and they don't sing one of your favorite hits, and then you like get angry and you feel like they wasted your time. Like, oh, he has to sing this song. But part of it is also because I think it's really illustrative of some critical points about civil liberties and why we ought to be so concerned about what's happening to them, not just now, but systematically. And, the American Civil Liberties of New Mexico is here tonight, and they're going to have a table out front, out back. And one encouraging sign of the Trump presidency, it's very difficult to find encouraging signs, but one encouraging sign is that the ACLU has experienced a huge tidal wave of support because people have rediscovered the importance of civil liberties now that Barack Obama is not in office. And I want to talk about why these civil liberties are so important and why things like privacy are so important. Because I'm somebody who has written about privacy and surveillance for a long time. And for a long time, I had a difficulty in writing about these questions, which is that it's very difficult to convince people, even people who want to kind of be your ally in this question, why this issue matters so much, why these civil liberties matter so much. It's extremely easy to get people to see why things like healthcare for their children or a job that lets them feed themselves and their family are important. That's just materially self-evident. You don't need to convince anybody of that. Things like privacy and due process and civil liberties tend to be more abstract and more ethereal, a little bit more distant, and therefore slightly more elusive in terms of their importance and the reasons why it's so imperative that we safeguard them. And for a long time, I struggled with that argument. I knew intuitively they were important, but to try and persuade people that they were, I found difficulty with. And there's one argument in particular that I always used to get confronted with, and actually still get confronted with, about why privacy really shouldn't matter. And I'm sure it's something that all of you have heard many times, and probably a lot of you actually think it's valid to at least some extent. So particularly when I was doing the reporting on the Snowden documents, and even before that, the argument that I would most frequently confront from people who would say, I don't really mind about these privacy infringements so much, was something along the following lines. They would say, like, look, if I were a terrorist and I were plotting terrorist attacks using the internet, I wouldn't want the government reading my emails. If I were a pedophile searching for child pornography or a violent criminal buying arms illegally, I wouldn't want the government listening to my telephone conversations. But since I'm not any of those things, I'm not a terrorist, I'm not a pedophile, I'm not a violent criminal, I don't really mind. I don't feel like I have anything to hide. And so it doesn't really bother me if the government is watching what I'm doing or reading my emails or listening to my telephone calls. And there's a lot of things to say about people who think that way. I could devote a whole speech to people who think that way. In fact, I have before. I don't, if you're interested, you can go online and find those. But I want to make just a couple of points about this mentality. For one thing, the people who say that they don't really have anything to hide, they don't actually mean it. All of us, every single one of you, you all have things to hide. There are so many things that I know that you're willing to tell your psychologist or your attorney or your wife or husband or your best friend that you would be mortified for the rest of the world to know. Everybody who says things like, I don't have anything to hide, they put and use locks on their bedroom and bathroom door. They put password protections on their email and their social media accounts. Whenever anybody says to me, I have nothing to hide, I don't have any reason to fear anybody knowing what I'm doing, I always say the same thing to them over years now. I've told this story before, and I'm still looking for some resolution to it. So whenever anyone says it to me, I take out a sheet of paper, and I write down my email address, and I say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home, and I want you to email to me all of the passwords to your email and social media accounts. Like, not just the nice, respectable work ones in your name, but all of them, so that I can just kind of like troll through them and publish whatever it is that I find interesting about what it is that you're doing and saying. Because after all, you're not a bad person, you're not a terrorist, you're not a criminal, you have nothing to hide. To this day, not one person has taken me up on that offer. Not one single person. I check that email a lot. It's a very lonely and desolate place. Nobody ever communicates with me there. And there's a reason why. There's a reason for that, which is that instinctively we understand that it is extraordinarily important to be a free and fulfilled human being, to have places we can go where we can think and explore and experiment without the judgmental eyes of other people, particularly authorities, being cast upon us. Knowing that we have a world or a place in the world where we can do that is extraordinarily important to human fulfillment. And there are all kinds of social studies and psychological studies that demonstrate that when human beings believe they're capable of being watched, the decisions that they make and the behavior they engage in changes radically. When you think you're being watched, the range of behavioral choices that you believe you have shrink considerably. The choices that you make when you think you're being watched tend to be the byproduct of what societal orthodoxy demands of you, or what the expectations are of other people, as opposed to your own autonomy and agency. And for that reason, having a place in the world where you can be safe from being monitored, it's really in that zone where things like dissent and creativity and individuality exclusively reside. And to allow that world to be eroded in the name of security because you have nothing to hide and aren't harmed by that, I think, is to really sacrifice something quite important and profound about the human experience. And what enabled me to understand that most was some work that I did in 2008 and 2009, 2010, when I started touring the country with various Muslim advocacy groups, because the work I was doing was of more interest to Muslim audiences than a general readership, because I was writing a lot about Guantanamo and torture and due process and terrorism prosecutions. And what I found when I would go speak in Muslim communities during that time period, and I had a very small readership then, the audience was tiny, they were 15, 20 people, so it was much more intimate, I could talk to a lot of people, and what I found was that what people would say to me, young Muslims would say things like, they would come up to me and say, you have to understand what it's like for a Muslim in the United States when somebody new comes to our mosque. Instead of being able to welcome them and build a community for them, we have to assume that they're actually there as an FBI informant to monitor what it is that we're saying and report the things that we do. And students who were Muslims would say to me, I can't even engage in vibrant political debates with my classmates or with my fellow dorm members because I'm petrified, because I've seen it over and over, that if I express political opinions that are deemed radical, that could be used to put me on a list or to view me as some kind of a radical threat. And so I just don't even participate in those kind of political debates. Or people who say, I'm really afraid to participate in the charity that my parents have long supported, because if I donate my time or donate my money and the government says, well, this charity is actually linked to this terrorist group in the Middle East, I could be charged, as so many Muslims have in the United States, with material support for terrorism. And what I began to see from all of that was something I really hadn't fully recognized before, was that there are forms of oppression and control much more potent than the most overt kind, like going into communities and just rounding up dissidents and putting them into jails. You can actually put a population into enough fear about the fact that they're being watched, about the fact that they're being monitored, that they actually give up their political rights on their own because they're afraid to exercise them. It creates actually a prison in the mind. And I think that when we think about things like the erosion of liberties and the attack on civil rights and the threat of authoritarianism and oppression and tyranny, we ought to look much more for that kind of a threat because A, it's much more difficult to find, and B, I think it's the much more probable way that these rights will be eroded. And I think that you see that over and over in the Trump presidency, the attempt to put populations in fear. You hear people afraid of leaving the country because they won't get back in, or people afraid to speak out because they'll be put on some kind of a list, or people in African-American populations being afraid that they're going to be attacked by the police with the encouragement of the Justice Department. This kind of fear is insidious, and it comes from the erosion of all of these rights. So even if you're not a terrorist, and even if you're not a pedophile or a violent criminal, we all have very much a vested interest in safeguarding the attack on those liberties and on those rights and on those privacy interests, because it really does erode political and personal life for all of us. And I think the people who exercise power understand that, and that is their strategy. Not to engage in overt forms of tyranny by setting up camps and putting people who criticize the government in prison, but the much more insidious and powerful and effective way of putting the population in fear by communicating to them that the government has no limits and you no longer have the rights that you were always taught that you should expect. So with that, I want to thank you once again for coming. I want to thank Lannon really again for putting on such an excellent event, and I look forward to talking further with you in the next part of the event. Thanks so much.